Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mental Health TV. Really nice to see you back with us today. Today we have a fantastic array of guests, and what we're going to be talking about is deaf awareness and mental health. So you'll be able to join in with us tonight. You can follow on Twitter using the hashtag MHTV and ask questions. And Dave's off camera tonight because we've got a full house, but he's going to be avidly scrolling through, seeing what you're doing and feeding back. So if you do have questions, please let us know. And likewise, if you're on Facebook following the live stream, you can absolutely comment there. And again, absolutely join in, ask questions. And we're really pleased to have you with us tonight. So let's go round. As I can see people, we're going to introduce everybody, but our questions are going to be for our panelists. So we start with Meghan. Hello, Meghan. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Meghan Luton. I'm a midwifery lecturer at Middlesex University. And the reason I'm here tonight is because I do have a sort of specialist interest in deaf awareness. I grew up around deaf people, and I'm currently learning to sign. I'm doing my BSL level 6. And as a result, I've ended up getting involved in a lot of deaf awareness projects, and I've just started my PhD looking at the experiences of deaf women in maternity services. So I've got a lot of involvement with deaf women mainly, but obviously mental health covers the whole population. So
absolutely. Lenka, hello, welcome.
Hello, good evening. My name is Lenka. And I'm here tonight to represent Southwest London St. George's Mental Health Trust. I'm the deaf advisor there. I've grown up within a deaf family myself. I went to a deaf school, I went to a mainstream school. I moved from another country. So I have a number of languages under my belt. And I started working here as a nanny initially, and then I moved on into education. And then I studied for a psychology degree and got a master's degree. And my passion is really mental health, and also mostly linked with young people, teenagers and adolescents, and their development, and how mental health can be so very important to them, and how best to support them into that development period.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Erika?
Hi, I'm Erika. I am Sign Health's community engagement worker. Sign Health is a charity. We're really passionate about improving health and well-being for deaf people. Sign Health partners with the NHS and other service providers across the country to make sure that deaf people can break down barriers and actually receive the same sort of access to healthcare as hearing people. The main three areas we cover are psychological therapy in BSL, domestic abuse, and social care. Now, I was actually born as a deaf person. I was born into a hearing family. I grew up using sign language from being very small. And I'm really looking forward to being part of this discussion this evening, as deaf awareness, mental health, and everything together is really a hot topic for me. And thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. And just to acknowledge our two fantastic interpreters, Helen and Rob, tonight as well. So thank you much, both of you. I think maybe we can start by just saying just a little bit about some of the issues facing the deaf community, particularly around COVID. Can we start there?
Okay, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's fine. Sign Health recently conducted a survey from August to September and surveyed participants over how COVID had affected them, and some very interesting results. Nearly 90% said that they were concerned that if they contracted COVID, they were worried about communication with hospital staff. Now, when we asked them, the three major issues for all of the community were 80% said social isolation. They said they'd had a big change in their lifestyle, access was limited. 62% said they were really worried over people wearing face masks and being able to communicate with them. And 56% said that it was access to healthcare. They just didn't have enough of it. And that was a really big concern. So those were the three things that were impacting the community at that time. And it was raising anxiety. 61% of people surveyed said that they had become anxious over that time. 60% both said it, the stress, the worry, and about the implications of that. And that was really clear evidence for Sign Health. We could look at that and we saw a massive impact on the community. So we've partnered with Interpreter Now. We've set up BSL Health Access, a specialist service, and that's used across the NHS. All staff know about it. And what it is, it's a VRS service, a video relay service, which means deaf people can use it to communicate with NHS staff through the remote platform during the COVID pandemic. And if there isn't an interpreter available or they can't be present for whatever reason, they could use this. Lenka.
Great. We shouldn't forget young people as well, because they're locked down, they've been sent home from school, so that their skills of socialization have become slightly different than what they're used to. They may not have complete communication with parents in their home, so there are lots of factors there. So I think we've seen an increase in the level of anxiety in young people, isolation as well. Of course, teaching goes on through Zoom, but will the schools provide interpreters in that situation? So it's become more and more difficult, and I think deaf young people have struggled in particular. Our service, we have 6 services. We have 4 deaf cams and an inpatient. It's the only inpatient service in the country, potentially the only one in Europe. And this is for deaf young people, teenagers and adolescents. And we have an outpatient community teams. And the CAMS outpatient team has worked particularly hard through COVID. We have 2 adult services as well, a community team and also an inpatient team. And they've all reported a huge impact, particularly when we think about the need to wear masks. Our trust has a really high percentage of deaf employees. So this is deaf nurses and healthcare assistants. And so communicating between them, and interpreters, and making sure that we provide equal access has really been an arduous journey. One of my particular role has been to find out masks that are effective in a deaf environment. We couldn't find a place in the UK that provided masks that were accessible for us to lip read. The ones that we sourced from overseas didn't match the kind of standards that we have here, infection control standards and things like that. So, and for the most part, the people who were manufacturing these masks were hearing and didn't understand maybe the nuances that are required for sign language users. So it's a myth that deaf people can lip read 100%. We can't, we simply can't. It's a very limited, very small percentage of communication that can happen through lip reading. So it's really important to make people understand that as a BSL user, if I'm trying to lip read someone, it's difficult for me. It's also difficult for people, of course, to try and make themselves understood. But we need to keep that in mind that with masks, it exacerbates that problem. We have been able to find some masks. We've been going okay. We recently set up a survey because it's the first time that we've ever had to experience remote working with young people. And it's very different, of course. All of our therapies are conducted face-to-face. Staff members have visited people's homes or visited people's schools or been in settings outside the hospital. But of course, with the amount of traveling that had to stop, it became remote. And then when you start thinking about an older generation of people who don't have access to technology or maybe don't understand technology in the way that they need to communicate remotely. So as I said, we set up a survey and we have questioned a number of people about, because we want to know not only how things have affected people, but what the people who work within our service and who we work with, how it's affected them.
I think it's important as well, just going back to Erika's point, to recognise that the deaf BSL community already have poorer health as a result of a lack of access to information and a lack of kind of background information. So they're not necessarily overhearing things at the dinner table or picking up information from media adverts. So we're already talking about a community with reduced access that's potentially been reduced even further.
So what sorts do
and just to follow on from that, sorry, Nicky.
Oh, go ahead.
Just to add into that. So some deaf people who don't understand the coronavirus information that's been publicised so far to date. So what they've had is we've been trying to make 2-minute summary guides to try and get that information translated, acceptable into a format that they understand in their first language and get it out there to people.
Yeah, that's a really big issue. If we look back at the start of lockdown, BBC News, the information that was coming from the government, sometimes there were no in-vision interpreters. I mean, I know up in Scotland and Wales, they were able to provide interpreters in these crucial news moments, but in England that wasn't happening. And there's been a number of people who've been campaigning for this for a long time, and it still seems to be an issue. I think deaf people really feel disempowered, despite the campaigns that have gone on to. If anything, COVID has just highlighted the extra stress that deaf people feel and the inequality. The Equality Act as requires that there's reasonable adjustment be made. And of course that includes the provision of interpreters, but it seems that people's voices are not being heard. And so it's really become the deaf community has really become very active about this because we want the same access as hearing people, that when news is being delivered that is of national importance, it's not good enough to just say, well, there's subtitling, there's subtitles for people, but that's not necessarily the case, because for a lot of us, BSL is our first language and not English, and sometimes it can lead to confusion. And there may be the case that there are organizations out there making summary explanations of things, but it's always a lot later than the times that other people hear the news. So in these kinds of situations, these emergencies, everybody needs to be included, and I think it's vital.
Yeah, it's access to health, and that is vital. And health information is.
Of course. And no access information means no access to health. You're right. Some people just don't know what it means, and and it potentially has serious consequences.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got some joining in with questions already. Thank you, Alfonso, saying it's lovely to have an episode on deaf awareness and health, and thanking you very much for coming on and educating us. And also Julia Terry joins us from Wales, and would like maybe to hear some of your thoughts on why deaf people have been disadvantaged for such a long time in terms of health information, because it's been going on for decades, she says.
Yeah, deaf history is really important, and this is one of the things that I'm looking at as part of my research. But I think we were talking just before we went live about the impact of a conference, an education conference that was held in 1880, and it was held in Milan. And this was an education conference that ultimately, for a variety of reasons, now is considered to be not really the gold standard of how you inform people. But ultimately it led to the ban of sign language in deaf education. So it meant that deaf children weren't allowed to learn in potentially their first language, a visual language. And the impact of this has lasted it's still with us now. And it's something that, has been a real legacy for deaf people in terms of being able to access sign language and being able to access education, because if the focus is on speaking, there's no focus on English, maths, science, and that kind of education. And I believe, although I'm sure Lenka and Erika may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was only in the 1980s, so 100 years later, that this was overturned, and that deaf children were allowed to access education in sign language.
Can you go ahead now?
Yeah, I mean, way back in 1880, the conference that Meghan's mentioning really had a massive impact on the education standards. Educational professionals brought in deaf people, but then decided that sign language shouldn't be used in schools. And it was prohibited to that extent. So schools that were using them around the world then had to suddenly change how they were teaching, and that has remained in place for many, many years. Interestingly, in the UK in the 1960s, there was somebody looked into it, and they were looking at gestures in schools, and there was no proper language taught, which was affecting deaf people. They were becoming less confident as adults. They didn't have a language to be able to access anything. They were not intellectually discriminated against. They just were not able to participate to the full extent of their potential, and that was 1960s. Then you look forward to 1975, and Mary Brennan did some research, and she looked at sign language use in the UK and said, yeah, there is language still happening around the UK. It is present, it is still in existence, and a lot of people were shocked. People started to become then proud of their language. They gave it a name, they gave it an official title as British Sign Language, and that recognition started there. Then you jump ahead again 30 years and you look at the York report, and it says more deaf children were putting into mainstream education, and sometimes they were the only deaf child in that school, which meant that really they had no access to deaf adults, they had no role models, they couldn't navigate through the hearing world by getting hints and tips from others, and actually a lack of opportunity to get those hints and tips. And it was all those things as a culmination that has impacted on and created the community we have today. Now, 2015, the Department of Education looked at the statistics and said 30% of deaf children were leaving secondary school achieving a GCSE, 36% compared to their 65% of hearing peers. The inequality was striking at that time, and they looked into how and began to start looking into how to break that.
It was a kind of discrimination, I suppose. The Milan conference, they really supported oralism, and they said that sign language at that time was, well, they said it was constituted gestures and wasn't a legitimate language. And that was one of the reasons that oralism and not signing was proposed. And it's been going on for centuries too. There was lots of shame attached to sign language. There were lots of incidents I can think of. As Erika said, education is primary to make sure that children leave school with the same kind of experiences, same kind of advantages that their hearing peers do. You know, and a lot of deaf people say that their real education begins when they're adults. They've left school and then they start to learn through learning sign language. And of course, one of the first places where you learn language is in your family, within your family. You know, when mum and dad speak to you. If you're born, and there's, of course, newborn hearing screening tests that are done. The doctors will say, "I'm so sorry, but your child has failed the hearing test." So right from the get-go, you have a negative connotation applied to it. And so parents immediately feel this sense of grief because their child is a failure. They can't understand what that means. There's a sense of panic. They start to imagine what the future life of this child will be. There's never an opportunity for a deaf adult, a role model, to say, "Look, it's okay. Things can work out fine." And so parents only ever receive one side of the picture. It's really biased, and I think it's really unfortunate. Also, of course, there are other ways that doctors will talk about interventions that can help. Cochlear implants have been really popular, but again, that can happen much later than when a child needs to acquire language. Hearing children start to communicate with their parents right from the beginning, and so it's vital that at that initial stage that parents start to bond with their child. And research has shown that hearing parents who have deaf children, the level of engagement is much shorter than it would be with hearing kids. So with deaf kids, they will speak less and communicate less than they would with maybe their brother or sister. Parents who are offered sign language classes, who learn sign language, and then go home and start to communicate with their children in sign language, we've noticed that these kids start to develop better. Meghan was talking about sitting at the dinner table and this kind of intermittent language that goes on. I mean, that's a really big, important part of communication. And the deaf child might say, "Sorry, what did you say? What's going on?" And the response of the parent most likely is, "Oh, don't worry, I'll tell you later," which can lead to a sense of frustration if the child doesn't understand what's going on, might even get up from the table and leave. And then people's reaction will be, "Oh my God, that boy's so rude, that child's not behaving well." And later on we can find out that maybe it was just an insignificant piece of conversation that was being missed. But all this sort of this hearing that is being missed by a deaf child, it's not necessarily something they need to be privy to because it's adult speaking. But later on, they can kind of think, "Oh, that's what was happening." But deaf children don't have opportunities for this incidental learning. They can see that their parents are fighting, for example, and they can understand from their behavior that it's okay to be angry. And then they go to school and they don't have the words or the language to express themselves. So they start to be labeled as a mischievous or troubled child. So what we want to do is to be able to provide information for the parents from the start, that when it happens that they're born with a child who's deaf, it's not the end. We need to change the attitude right at the beginning, right when the child is born. That's the attitude I think we need to address.
I fully agree with that, Lenka. 90% of deaf children are born to hearing families. I was one of that 90%, born to hearing of families, but I was really lucky in that my family did learn to sign, and that bit of language enabled it for me to be easier. They fit in with what I was doing. It helped me to access other things. I could access information in sign language, and then through that sign language I learned English, because then I could question my family, say, what does this English word mean, and they could sign it to me. So that was really, really lucky for me, a privilege that I had that a lot of deaf children don't have. And when you think about other modes of communication for them, other things, they struggle through life, and it's sort of like double discrimination. They can't achieve. It's if you're trying to get to a job, the impact, the knock-on effect of all of those things links back to your education, and again your mental health. The ability to engage with people, if it's always there as an issue in your mind, your background, your history, your culture, your language is always a key part of you, your family, your upbringing, it's always a key part of you as an adult. And if it helps you integrate, it helps you fit in, and you've got to have that.
Yeah, but let me be clear. The word deaf doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have mental health problems. I was born and I was deaf. I mean, of course, I faced barriers in my life, and I could talk about that all day. But I grew up as a really very resilient child and started to have a normal life. People who do go through experience lots of barriers. I mean, that's something that applies to all humans, isn't it? We have to think, maybe as simple as something making a GP appointment. For hearing people, we pick up the phone, you call, you make an appointment, it's done. It's something that people take for granted. Whereas for a deaf person, you either use an interpreter. There are lots of small things that occur on an everyday basis that can just build up within a person and make them just just feel really vulnerable and susceptible to mental health. That's how things start to occur. It's environmental, not because they're deaf, but because of a build-up of environmental factors and experiences that make it difficult. Erika explained it very, very clearly. But once the barriers are out of the way, life just goes on and we operate pretty well. The percentage of deaf people who experience mental health compared to hearing kids is about 25%, compared to about 45% of deaf kids who are experiencing mental health issues. This research was done back in 1994. Peter Hindley was the person who conducted this. And I wonder whether or not that's actually increased because of COVID. I wonder whether or not the statistics for deaf young people experiencing mental health, but the number of male suicide, the number of people who have passed away as a result of deaths, especially those who are in a specialist service. It's important that we try to make sure that we have research that explores what's been going on.
I think as well, there's a lot of good research in the deaf community about the idea of deaf identity, and that's been impacted a lot by the deaf history. This, if all deaf children are mainstreamed, they might be the only deaf person. So where are they learning about deaf history, deaf identity, deaf culture? They might previously have learned from a deaf teacher, but now, teachers of the deaf don't necessarily need to sign. So it's not a requirement of the job necessarily. So this idea of deaf identity sometimes comes a bit later. And I've, through my journey of learning to sign, I've met a lot of deaf adults who themselves are learning to sign at the age of 30 or 40 because they finally found this place where they fit. And they can now communicate in a language that feels more natural to them because they're visual people. And they share their stories of feeling isolated in mainstream school. Yes, they had hearing friends. They were had friends and they were welcomed, and they may identify as hearing because they're from a hearing family, but actually there is a complexity to their identity that isn't fully appreciated. And I think this is really important when we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about the provision of services, that actually, if you're from a deaf culture, then you need culturally competent mental health services.
This is a question that's coming through a lot, actually, from different people. So talking about what skills...
I'm sorry to interrupt. My research, when I was studying, I worked at Corner House whilst I was doing my master's degree. And a lot of young people who came to our service, it was the first time they'd actually seen deaf adults and interpreters. Yeah. And I remember speaking to young people and saying, oh my gosh, hearing people can sign. And it was they were very confused and surprised. And I also think there was a real sense of relief that they had found a place where young people, where people around them would sign. There was a bright young kid, I think they were 15 years old, when they first got to our service, and they were utterly shocked that they could communicate with us. And we were fluent BSL users, and from the first time that I worked there, I began to realize that the children feel finally that they're able to explore themselves and to understand who they are. And I think one of the parts of their identity which could also be true for me is that I'm deaf, but that's one of many parts of me. And I'm feeling part of a community. I belong. I think I'm proud of my identity. I think over the years I've heard young people say, I feel part of something. And it's not just mental health necessarily, but it's a question of things that have been missing from their lives for so long. And this person that we was talking about went on to university and has done really well. It's important that we have role models, that we have linguistic role models out there as well, so that deaf kids are able to exceed and excel.
So the question that keeps coming through is what can we do? What can health staff and students do to engage and better support deaf service users?
I think Lenka's point is... Oh.
Sorry, can I just have a bit of clarification? Can you just repeat the question, Nicky?
Yeah, of course. What skills do you recommend for health and social care students and professionals to engage and better support deaf service users?
I think Lenka was talking about...
Sorry.
Go on. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Megan, I didn't realize you were talking. Go ahead.
I think what Lenka was saying about, she has deaf is part of her identity, but it's not her whole identity. And I think, especially if you're a hearing healthcare worker, which I am, I think it's true that we need to be listening to people, all people, but remembering that deaf people have been navigating their deafness in a hearing world their whole lives. And so they're going to want things that, we can give you tips and advice all the time, but actually you need to ask the deaf person what it is that they need specifically. And so, I can give you an example. I have a friend who's accessed inpatient mental health services. And when she was in distress, in the inpatient services, she would had a panic disorder. She would start panicking. That's when they would get an interpreter for her. And she didn't want the interpreter. She felt like that was two people coming down on her, the healthcare worker and the interpreter. It was all in her face. And of course, the healthcare worker thought they were doing the right thing. And she kept saying, please don't bring an interpreter. Please don't bring an interpreter. Just calm me down or stroke my back but don't bring an interpreter. Bring the interpreter afterwards to explain to me what happened. And that was her preference, even though we might have advised the healthcare worker, well, you always need to have an interpreter there. It's not what the deaf person wanted.
Mm. Mm.
I don't think it really matters whether you're deaf or hearing. What really matters is that we don't make assumptions about people. You know, we remain open-minded. I think that's what I would offer. You can read lots of stories about people, but not having assumptions. I mean, I'm sure deaf people, who are very expert at recognizing facial expressions might think, just calm down. I'm not necessarily that in need of help right now. But what's important is communication. I think one of the things we need to always ask people is, what's your preferred communication method? Because not all deaf people want to talk or use interpreters. The deaf community is very, very varied and diverse. So I think one of my tips is ask a person what their preferred language is. If the situation is serious, and of course deaf people can be quite vocal when they're angry. It can be the case that they get misinterpreted and the police are involved, and then they get sectioned, and that they were just, nothing was really going on other than just being angry. So it could be the fact that they were misdiagnosed because there either was an interpreter or there wasn't an interpreter. Mm-hmm. But I think one of the things that I would offer when you're around deaf people is just breathe. It's all quite simple. Establish a level of rapport with a deaf person, and that just will go. That will be a really beneficial gesture. I think hearing people think, gosh, I can't sign, I don't know what to do. I think one of the things I would have basic gestures like, want a cup of tea, want a coffee, want something like that. That human contact is so very important. It doesn't necessarily matter that you can sign at level 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If you have issues, and if you're feeling upset mentally, of course, knowing that somebody is there and is recognizing that you're upset, buy a cup of tea is important.
Yeah, I think it's important to show people making the effort to engage. You're not just forcing that person to lip read you all the time, because it's impossible to do that. It's exhausting. To offer them something else, a pen and paper. I mean, the deaf community have so many different communication methods. Some people do prefer to speak and lip read. Some people do prefer a pen and paper if there's no interpreter. But some people do even just prefer a gesture with communication. So it's important to think about that, but also to be aware that when you're specifically looking at service delivery around the UK, mental health professionals, it's useful to know who you have in your area, to know who you can tap into and contact, especially for IAPT. We're the only IAPT service in BSL, and we provide a specifically tailor-made assessment service for deaf people.
Also, let's remember, it depends on the severity of the person's condition, of their illness, because not everybody is suited for talking therapies, because there are lots of abstract theories that are involved in talking therapies, and it might be the case that people just don't have the kind of emotional language to talk about that. So there needs to be some sort of psychological input And referral is important, because making sure that deaf people get referred to the right place. Often deaf people get referred to a hearing service, and then they might bring in an interpreter. It could be that that would lengthen the amount of time that they stay involved in therapy. So making sure that deaf people are signposted and referred to the right place. And it depends a lot on whether or not the GP, it's such a big advantage if GPs are aware of the services out there that are specifically cater to the needs of deaf people. They make it much easier to access via funding or whatever is needed. So we have to be realistic, but that's a really good place to start with GPs.
And just to add into that, it's also about hearing people just connecting. They think it's cheaper to just refer them to a hearing service, but also there's a guide to commissioning mental health services for deaf people, and it does say that statistically BSL therapies are cheaper in the long run, because booking an interpreter is expensive, because then you need more sessions, because the time take it long. Sometimes deaf people are anxious and they have increased anxiety over who the interpreter is. Do I know them? Are they familiar with me? Are they too familiar with me? Have I used them somewhere else in my life? So again, some interpreters have worked, they use at work that they might not want to use for their therapy. They want to keep it separate for their life. They might not, they won't want the same. So they might also have different interpreters coming to every session, which doesn't lead to continuity of access for health and doesn't actually help that connection between therapist and client. They might have a male interpreter and they want a female. They might struggle to find an interpreter for that session, which again, that might delay care. Or it might cancel the session if they've had one booked and then they struggle to find one. So BSL therapies have proven to be cheaper. They've proven to have additional benefit to clients. There was one case study that we had that was a sign health worker and a client. And the client had anxiety of falling. They worried that people would laugh and nobody would help. And again, they looked at the therapist, they went with them. The therapist and the client were looking at people falling. Obviously, a lot of people do offer to help in that sort of situation. But again, the therapist was deaf, but it proved a real life situation in that mock instance, that recreation of falling, how that people wouldn't laugh, they would offer assistance, but also the therapist could then demonstrate how to cope, how to communicate. And that was really, really advantageous on top of the basic therapy.
Also linked to interpreters. Professionals we need more professionals who can sign. That's it. The service that I work in, we have a regular pool of interpreters that work with us. And they are trained as interpreters, of course, but they also have years of experience in mental health. Lots of them are freelancing interpreters. But it's really important to say, I think, that if you encounter a deaf person, and then maybe you could use a member of your family to interpret. I've got to say right here and now, that's a no-no. We cannot have members of the family interpreting for deaf people, because very often they would fix or amend the message, and the deaf person is not getting the amount of access that they have the right to. Of course, deaf people in any situation have the right to be in charge of and in control of their lives, to make decisions, and not to feel control. Lots of deaf people are also very vulnerable too. There's lots of sympathy that gets applied to deaf people that isn't necessarily necessary. So it's really important, I think, to make sure that when you don't look at deaf people as disadvantaged. We're the same. We just have we use a different language. and that language, for the most part, is sign language.
I've got a couple more questions. I'll just quickly squeeze them in. So one is from Lynn. Hello, Lynn, who says, could BSL be made a compulsory skill, especially for services that should be confidential, when having to have an interpreter might be intrusive or a barrier? And then there's a second question, which is, it's come through, I think, probably from one of our psychology students, and they're asking, should a deaf person have a deaf psychologist or a deaf counsellor because of the shared experience, the shared lived experience?
Can I answer the question about it making BSL a compulsory skill? I'd like to say it has been very hard to learn BSL and adopt the grammar and fully appreciate the nuances and the characterization and the grammar is so wildly different. I really still struggle, and I've been studying it for quite a long time. So I think making it a compulsory skill is too complicated. And actually, I think in my experience of speaking to deaf people, they don't necessarily, it's lovely, like Lenka was saying, it's lovely if you can offer a cup of tea and tell them your name, but sometimes that can create more anxiety, because if there's not deaf awareness that goes with that, you think you're communicating, and actually they need full interpretation from somebody with who's been studying for 10 or 15 years, who appreciates the culture, who appreciates, I would never interpret myself because I haven't been involved in the community for long enough to appreciate those things. So I think making it compulsory, no. I think if you want to learn, I think BSL education should be more accessible. It's quite expensive at the moment, but that's because it's a really specialist skill. So, it's a complicated thing to answer, but compulsory, no. But if you want to learn, I think you absolutely should, and be able to introduce yourself and offer a cup of tea and just put a deaf person at ease, a deaf BSL user at ease when they arrive. But know how to book an interpreter, know how to provide deaf aware services. I think that would be, from my experience, that's the sort of feedback I've been given.
One thing about learning BSL is that you don't necessarily become deaf aware. For example, if you decide to learn French, you go to a French course and you speak French. Of course, you don't really necessarily have to know much about French culture. So there are things that are acceptable within French culture and British culture and vice versa that aren't compatible. It's the same with deaf people. Sometimes deaf people will look at each other and without even speaking will know that they're both deaf. There's something innate, say for example, you move to another country and you hear someone speaking your mother language for the first time, and you go, oh, and you would make eye contact with them. You wouldn't really necessarily have to talk, but if you hear them speaking English or whatever your mother tongue is, you have that moment of connection, don't you? It's something that happens with deaf people as well. When we employ interpreters in sessions, it's important for the clinicians to understand and to be able to assess a deaf patient. But they might ask questions in a particularly English fashion. So it's up to the interpreter to be able to moderate and modulate and culturally adapt that language so it's understood. So it's important to recognize that, say for example, that someone was experiencing depression, they wouldn't make eye contact. And of course, sign language requires that you make eye contact. If the person managed to make just a second of eye contact, an interpreter is trained and will be able to relay that. An interpreter would be able to say, look, this has happened. what just happened there there was a glimmer of connection, and that's something that is vital for us to remember. Because a lot of deaf people go through life without making connections to people very easily, and so we need to bear that in mind. So learning sign language, learning BSL is not necessarily understanding the culture. It's the beliefs, the values, the connections that deaf people have with each other, the storytelling, the jokes, the drama. It's such a rich culture. It really is. And the facial expressions, body movements, role shift, all those kinds. I haven't met Erika before tonight, and right away, as soon as we saw each other on camera, we immediately started having a warm kind of connection. We were talking about the regional differences in sign. She said the sign for home, and she says home like this. I say home like this, and I'm like, oh, you must be from the north, right? Because right away we had that connection. And this was even before we introduced our names. This is something very particular to deaf people, I think. Obviously, we find out what each other's names were next, but the sense of, oh, you're deaf like me. And the same could be said of deaf people who travel internationally. There's an immediate connection that I think, if you want to be part of that, it's more than just learning sign language. It's becoming part of the culture.
And it's the same as Lenka said there. When you look at people all over the UK and America, although we both speak English, the sign language is very, very different. But the deafness is the same. I can meet an American person and still have that communication, even if it's a lot visual, more visual than it would be in England. But we have that connection because it's culturally very, very similar.
There are lots of videos out there, and I watch people from Thailand using sign language. I watch people from America or Korea, African countries. It's nice to watch people from different cultures using sign language. I'm not, great at using international sign, but I like to watch people communicate. And when I meet people, it doesn't take long before we establish a kind of common vocabulary. You're absolutely right. It's a marvelous part of our world.
Okay. I think we've run so far and fast. We've covered loads of things. None of the things that we said we were going to, but that's fine. We'll have to do this again, I think. It's a lot to fit in, isn't it? So I think maybe if we just go around and ask people what the thoughts they want to leave people with are. So who would like to go first?
I don't mind going first. I think you've listened to our conversations, and hopefully there's been food for thought. And I think hopefully that you reflected on, don't run for the hills if you meet a deaf person. Be warm and engaging. If you're excited to learn BSL, then that's great. Please do that. Please feel free to socialize. I mean, it's not easy at first. I welcome people to come and visit our service. I think it's vital that there are differences between the hearing world and the deaf world, but I think we need to get rid of some of these barriers. And hopefully, one of my biggest hopes is that don't be ashamed. Speak to people. If you need tips and advice, if you need anything, it's important that we work together. I'm happy to do that.
That's what I wanted to say, Lenka. Sorry, you've summed it up in a nutshell. No, it's great. It's great that we're thinking along the same lines. And really, I would say that to people as well. I welcome questions. I welcome deaf people, their comments, their advice, your questions, because it's about making sure that people can work together to improve mental health access for all deaf people. And Sign Health is really passionate about that. We want to break down those barriers areas for deaf people, and doing that is by working together to create videos in BSL, to create health information and get it out to people.
Yeah.
So I think really it's about meeting a deaf person, maybe learning a bit of BSL. It would be fantastic. It will make that deaf person's day, you know, even just to know a little bit. And it just brightens their day because it might be the connection that they need.
Yeah, I agree. I think I find the deaf community incredibly welcoming, right from the beginning of my BSL journey until now, where I'm a bit more independent with my signing. You know, I've always been welcomed. I've been teased when I've signed things wrong. I once told a deaf person that my husband wears high heels instead of he goes cycling because I used the wrong finger. So, you know, and I get teased for that still. And, you know, it's a lovely community. And I think the one thing I would say is just have it in the back of your mind. If you're moving to a telephone service, how is a deaf person going to access that independently? It's those little things that really make the big difference.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. That's been so helpful listening to you guys tonight. We're still having people commenting, by the way. They're not stopping. Julia's saying that she in Wales is starting a conversation with Health Education and Improvement Wales about deaf awareness in health professional education. That's coming up in December. Obviously, it's better if deaf people lead these conversations. So if anyone wants in on that, you can either contact any of us or her on Twitter or on Facebook and you can get in there. And Lynn Mayer said, it's really great to think of deaf awareness as cultural awareness rather than understanding a disability, which also I think is it's a really positive way of doing it. There was a couple of things coming up that Dave has obviously been on my case to say. So next week, we've got Star Awards coming up. So that's the Bright charity, that service user led a charity that has done such a lot to revolutionise the voice of service users in the mental health community and also just improve standards to make things joyful and healing and recovery focused. So grateful for them coming on. Then we're looking at controversies in care. We're looking at people with personality issues. And then we've got a review of 2020 because that's how fast this year has gone. So, yeah, if there's anybody who's asking questions who still hasn't had a chance to come back, we'll be coming back onto Twitter and onto Facebook, and we'll be answering your questions. We've also got Meghan's very delightful recommendations, which include Caitlin Moran's Ode to Camel Toe being very joyously signed. So if no one's seen that before, get ready. And it just leaves us tonight to say thank you so much to Lenka, Erika and Meghan, and also to Helen and Rob. Thank you very, very much. Awesome to see you. And good night, everyone.